evening. As we are making sure we get as many people in as possible, do feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat. You can share your name, the country you're joining us from, and maybe also share your role. So in the chat, you can put your name, the country you're joining us from, and your role before we get started with this evening's session. Welcome once again. Okay, wonderful. Welcome to our facilitator, Dr. Susan Lambert from the US. Welcome to Mona, who's joining us from Egypt, and Mona is a kindergarten teacher. You're welcome. Please do share your name in the chat, the country you're joining us from, and your role as we wait for more people to join, and then we'll begin the session. I can see some of our ADO members on the call, so welcome to all of you. Welcome to Ruby, welcome to Justina, welcome Fatty. Good to have you all online this evening. Those of you just joining us, welcome once again. Welcome to the Africa Dyslexia Organization Online Academy. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. My name is Samantha Barrett Aqua, and I'm a counselor with ADO, and I'll be moderating the session this evening. So we will begin in the next 5 minutes or so. But as we're waiting for others to join, please do type in the chat. Let us know your name. Let us know the country you're joining us from. We have participants from across Africa, so we want to welcome you. And then maybe just share what your role is. I hope those online can hear me okay. Can I get a thumbs up emoji so I know that you can hear me well? Wonderful, great. Okay. So do type in the chat, let us have your name. Okay, it seems like the chat may be disabled. So let's just work on that and then you can share with us. So bear with me one moment. Okay, great. So we've got our chat working now. So welcome to Ruth, who's joining us from Ghana. Welcome, Michelle, Portia, also from Ghana. You're welcome this evening. So if you've just joined, my name is Samantha Baratakwa. I'm a counselor with ADO, and I'll be moderating our session for this evening. Before we begin, I just wanted to welcome you all. So those of you who have typed your names in the chat, thank you. So I think we have Tobogo, I hope I've pronounced that well, from Botswana. Welcome to Patience, to Matilda, Belinda from Ghana. Let's get them all in here, hold on. We've got Abigail, who's an administrator from Ghana, Betty also from Ghana. Who else do we have this evening? We have we have Abahi from Calabar, Nigeria, who's the head of school. You're welcome this evening. Welcome to Patience. also from Ghana. Lovely to see Ghana representing this evening. Philomena, Jennifer, Comfort from Nigeria, you're welcome. Welcome online to Ruth Edna from Nairobi. Great. Welcome to Judith from Cameroon. Wonderful. It's good to see all of you online. And welcome to this evening's session. So we're going to begin very soon. Welcome to Esther, grade 4 facilitator from Ghana. We have Upendo from Tanzania. You're welcome this evening. All right, great. Okay, so as more people join, I just want to speak a little bit about Africa Dyslexia Organization so you know who we are and what we do. So Africa Dyslexia Organization is a pan-African organization working to ensure that individuals with dyslexia and related learning differences are not excluded from education, employment, or leadership opportunities. Now, our work focuses on early identification, teacher and systems capacity building, research, advocacy, and structural reform. Now, despite our best efforts, many learners across Africa continue to struggle because they are not taught using approaches grounded in scientific evidence. So this evening, we begin a 2-day training on the science of reading and the science of writing, drawing on decades of interdisciplinary research to explain how literacy develops and what effective instruction looks like. We are delighted to bring this training to educators from across Africa, and it's completely free of charge. So you're all very welcome to this 2-day training. All right, so tonight is day 1, and that is the science of reading. Now, this session will explore how children develop reading skills, the research frameworks that underpin effective reading instruction, and then how we distinguish evidence-based practice from common misconceptions. So that's for day 1 tonight. Tomorrow, for day 2, we'll turn to the science of writing. So we'll be exploring how writing develops alongside reading and how research can inform more integrated literacy instructions. All right, so before we jump into the session, I'd like to start with a little bit of housekeeping. Now, this session is being recorded and may be used for educational and public dissemination purposes by the Africa Dyslexia Organization. Now, participants are expected to maintain professional standards. So if your cameras are on, please ensure that you're appropriately dressed, that you have an upright posture and a suitable camera angle and background. Please, there should be no eating on camera. If you're unable to maintain a professional camera presence, please do keep your camera off. Now, our ADO safeguarding extends to our online spaces. Now, this includes respectful communication, so no inappropriate visuals or gestures. There should be no independent recording of the session and no sharing of private participant information. And professional conduct should take place within the chat and verbally. Please note that ADO reserves the right to remove participants who do not adhere to these standards. Now, for participations, questions may be placed in the chat throughout the session, and there will be a live Q&A which will be held at the end. We have sign language interpretation available throughout this evening. So we have Martin, who is interpreting during the training session, and Josiah, who will be doing the interpretation during the Q&A segment. Okay, so something very important that I want us to pay attention to is about the certificates. Now, for participants who would like to receive a certificate of participation, please note the following. So as I've said, the training itself is free of charge. To receive a digital certificate, participants must complete the post-training feedback form and make a voluntary contribution. Now, the contribution is 50 Ghana cedis or the dollar equivalent for one session or for each single session, or if you are attending both, then it's 100 Ghana cedis for the two sessions. And that is purely to support the administrative processing. Now, if you want a hard copy certificate, which is available, then for one session, you would need to pay 100 cedis. So please note that delivery fees are exclusive. So you will need to note the charge for you as an individual would be different for each participant, and the delivery fees will be borne by the participant. Okay, so how can you contribute? You can either pay by MTN mobile money. I'll read the number out, but it will also appear in the chat once I've finished this announcement. So MTN mobile money to Africa Dyslexia Organization on 024 184 3287. So that's for MTN mobile money on 024 184 3287. This will be posted in the chat shortly. Okay, now this is what's really important. After making your payment, please state which of the sessions you've made the payment for. So if it's for payment 1, payment 2, or payment 1 and 2, then you need to send a WhatsApp message to the number I've just read out, which will also appear in the chat, and it must include your full name exactly as you want it to appear on your certificate. So please be very mindful that you type it exactly as you wish it to appear on your certificate. Okay. Then you need to also include your correct email address where the certificate will be sent. So that's your full name as you want it to appear on your certificate, your correct email address, and then please note that you should indicate whether you've paid for one session or two sessions, the session 1, day 1, or day 2. Please do not send the payment screenshot alone. If you send this without your full name and without your correct email address, our accounts team will not be able to process or deliver your certificate. So please ensure that you have those details included. We really want every participant who requests a certificate to receive it without any difficulty. Now, payment details will also, I think they've already been posted in the chat. So if you look in the chat, you'll see the full details of how to make payment. It will also be included with the feedback form after the session. So when you complete your feedback form, you'll see the details of how to make payment and how to receive your certificates. Please note that certificates will be issued after verified attendance, completed feedback, and confirmation of contribution. Okay. All right, so we're ready to get into the session. So I would now like to introduce our facilitator for this evening. It is my privilege to introduce our facilitator for this session, and that is Dr. Susan Lambert, who is the Chief Academic Officer for Literacy at Amplify and the host of Science of Reading, the podcast, which is an award-winning program highlighting current research and evidence-based practices in literacy education. With a distinguished career spanning classroom teaching, district leadership, and educational consulting, Dr. Lambert has contributed to the advancement of
I think there is a problem with it. She'll be back. Dr. Lambert, she'll join us soon.
Okay. Do you want me to just go ahead and start?
I'm coming. I'm coming. I'll get back to you.
I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen,
So
and maybe you can see that, right?
Yes, I can see. So you can
Yes.
introduce and start.
Okay.
Yeah, I think Dr. Susan, you can take the lead and just give a brief introduction of who you are. And I know some
Sure.
of them may know you already, especially those that attended Africa Dyslexia Conference last year. But for those who don't know, you can know a little bit about you, and then you can start, and then Samantha will take over later on at the closing to read your bio properly. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you. And she already got through part of my bio. So I have worked in lots of spaces, being a teacher, being an administrator. I've worked in schools in the United States and I've worked in schools around the world. And I think the thing that's most important that you should know about me is that I have a son with dyslexia. And because of my son, his name is Michael, I was very motivated to get into the world of education. And my expertise is really understanding how to deliver preventative instruction to all students. But I also have done some work with dyslexia. So I'm really honored to be here. I'm a little intimidated. I just want to let you know, because one of the places I haven't worked extensively is in Africa. And so many of the slides that you're going to see today, and I'll mention them too, are really from my point of view, which is mostly my work here in the United States and also in North America. But the great thing about the science of reading is that we have a lot of research from around the world, and we're going to dive into that today. All right. So you did hear this, that I am host of Science of Reading, the podcast. The reason I'm putting this slide up now is that if you're not familiar with it, I really encourage you, not because I'm such a great host, but because we have amazing guests. And last season we did a season all about comprehension and really the complexities involved in comprehension. And many of the things that you're going to hear me say today are relevant, and we have those researchers on these podcast episodes. And so they come out every 2 weeks, and they're just a really great way for you to continue your own professional development and potentially engage others in those conversations too. So again, Science of Reading, the podcast, and again, it's free and just breaks down a lot of the research that we're talking about today. Okay. Please, if you have questions, make sure that you get them in the chat. I'm going to leave time at the end to make sure that we can address as many as I can, as many as I'm able. And then we're going to think about how we can prepare for tomorrow. So part 2 is the science of writing. So for today's objectives, we really have several. We're going to define the science of reading and describe its interdisciplinary research base, and maybe even describe what we mean by that word interdisciplinary. We're going to look at 2 really important models that help us understand skilled reading. One is the simple view of reading, and one is Scarborough's reading rope. And many of you probably already know something about them. And I'll explain to you why I think it's so important to get grounded in those models. We'll look at the relationship between word recognition, language comprehension, and reading comprehension, and why that relationship is so important. We're going to look at some evidence-based principles and also dispel some common misconceptions about the science of reading. I'll tell you, here in the United States, that the science of reading got really a kind of a bad name at first, and there was some myths surrounding that. And as we're gaining momentum here in the United States, I think those myths are being dispelled, but I want to talk to you a little bit about some of those. And then throughout, this last bullet I really want you to focus on throughout our conversation today is, what are the implications of these frameworks and these principles for really effective literacy instruction, that leads to student success. So here we go. Make sure you have paper and pencil, or some writing utensil, something to take some notes on, because I will ask you to do a couple activities, including putting some things in the chat. So thank you, Samantha, for getting the chat working again. Or you can use your computer if you are able to multitask and take notes on your computer while you're also watching. That is not my gift to multitask that way, but maybe you can do that. But be prepared. So we're going to start and we're going to just jump right into the science of reading. So here's your first activity. The first thing that I'd like you to do, not in the chat yet, but on your either piece of paper and pencil with your pencil or on your computer, I'm going to give you about a minute to write all the words or phrases that you think we're going to discuss related to the science of reading. And I really am going to give you a minute to do that. It'll be an awkward silence minute, but go ahead and take some time to do that. All right, finish up your final thought or word or phrase. And while you're doing that, I would love if you could, in the chat, share one or two, maybe three keywords or phrases that you recorded. So go ahead and put that in the chat. Oh, phonology, phonological awareness, semantics, blending and segmenting. Oh, lots of good ones here. Reading development, writing. We're going to do writing tomorrow, but think about how writing relates. Phonemes, graphemes, phonemes. Explicit instruction, the brain. Yes, we're going to talk about the brain. Comprehension. Oh, I love all this. Sounds. Words, articulation of words, blending. Great. Syllables. We have a great start here. And continue to throw those in the chat. I'm going to keep going so that we can actually get to our Q&A. But it's really fun to see some of those words and phrases and many, many, many things we're going to cover. So the first thing we're going to do, though, is we're going to talk about what do we mean by science and what do we mean by reading. So we're going to break down this science of reading idea. So what exactly do we mean by science? And I think this is very misunderstood, especially in the education community, right? So if you ask a scientist what they mean by science, that's pretty much well understood. But sometimes in the education community, we don't really understand what we mean by that and how to protect ourselves from things that aren't scientific. So three things, right? We mean scientifically based research, we mean evidence-based practices, and we're talking about the scientific method. Okay, let's unpack those three things. So what is scientifically based research? Well, this is research that involves the application of rigorous, systematic, and objective procedures so that we get reliable and valid knowledge relevant to the thing that we're studying. And this helps explain why we sometimes feel like science evolves really slowly, right? Because in order to find out what works, to find out these things that are what we call scientifically based research, it takes time to hypothesize, to plan a study, to do the study, to evaluate the study. And so we may sometimes get frustrated that science moves slowly, but when we're thinking about who we're impacting, at least in the context of the science of reading, we're talking about impacting children and preparing them for their future. And so we want to make sure that what we're doing is scientifically based and follows that process. Well, what do we mean by evidence-based practices? We really throw this term around a lot in education. And I think sometimes we assume everybody knows what it is. Oh, look at this. It's an evidence-based practice. But I will tell you, a true evidence-based practice is anything that we do with students, whether it's an activity, whether it's a strategy, whether it's an intervention, something that shows a statistically significant effect on improving student outcomes. Wow, that's a lot of jargon. What does statistically significant mean? It means that we've gone through that scientific-based research and we've found that that thing, whether it's an activity, strategy, or intervention, actually had an impact on student outcomes. And I will tell you that there's a lot of things we could be doing with students, whether it's whole class instruction, intervention, and they might seem to us like they make sense, but we have limited time when we're talking about instruction or intervention instruction, and we want to ensure that we're delivering high impact strategies or that evidence-based practices. So that's something you can think a little bit more about. And then I like to talk a little bit about the scientific method. This might seem like, oh, don't we all know this? But sometimes we forget, right? This means we're going to read the research that's already there. We're going to develop some sort of hypothesis. We're going to test that hypothesis in a very formal way. We're going to look at the results and then maybe have to revise that hypothesis and repeat the test, or just repeat the test to see if it replicates. And then if we have something successful in a hypothesis, it becomes a theory that we can go then back in and test again. So we're going to look at a couple of frameworks today, and many of the elements of these frameworks have been tested over and over and over again and have been shown to actually impact student reading outcomes. Okay, so we understand what we mean by science. What do we mean by reading? And when we think about reading, we want to remember that it's a very complex process. It includes, in terms of evidence-based strategies, not just reading, but reading. And if there was no such thing as writing, we wouldn't have to learn how to read. So reading and writing are super important, and so are speaking and listening. And we're going to look at this developmental process tomorrow when we start to think about writing, but just know that when we say reading, we don't just mean issues related to reading. It includes reading, writing, speaking, and listening, right? And all this is so that we can identify words in print. And I put the word instantly in parentheses because that's the goal, is to have instant word recognition. We need to be able to construct meaning from those words. And we need to coordinate then the identification of words and the meaning of the words. And we have to do that with automaticity and accuracy. And we'll unpack this a little bit when we look at the frameworks. I like to use this defining guide from an organization called the Reading League here in the United States. You will get access to this slide deck, but there is a website there, or you can Google Science of Reading, the defining guide, and get this really lovely defining guide that helps you understand the science of reading. Many of the things that I'm talking about today are in this guide. The best part of this guide is a great definition. That's why it's called the defining guide, right? They wanted to put out there a definition of the science of reading. And their definition, look, and the words in orange are mine to highlight this. The science of reading is a vast interdisciplinary body of scientifically based research. We already talked about the scientifically based research, right? So we're not looking at a body of evidence that hasn't gone through this scientific process. And by interdisciplinary, we're talking about research from education, research from speech language pathology, from psychology, from sociology, from neurology, right? So the interdisciplinary part is these different disciplines are studying this process we call reading. And what happens is they come together and this evidence starts to converge, meaning that they're finding similar findings even across the different disciplines. Note here too that it says this research body is about reading and issues related to both reading and writing. Reading and writing are reciprocal processes. We're going to talk about the writing part tomorrow. One of the misconceptions is that this is new research. It's not. We've been doing this research for more than 5 decades, and thousands and thousands of studies in multiple languages and around the world. So our frame isn't just the research we've done here in the United States, but it comes from research across the world. And that research is continuing to replicate. So people are continuing to do similar studies to see if the science is holding. And it's expanding as our understanding of how we learn how to read expands. In the science of reading, we talk a lot about this idea of the preponderance of evidence, right? That's what I talked about, interdisciplinary, all these different disciplines studying it, all converging to find very similar findings. And it's this body of evidence that we really draw from. There are things like phonemic awareness, that there's so much research on it now that it almost doesn't need to continue to be researched because we know how important phonemic awareness is to learning to read. So that's just an example. It also helps us understand how proficient reading and writing develop, and then why some have difficulty. So in this context, dyslexia, right? Why students with dyslexia have more trouble and what they might need to be able to access this thing we call the printed word. How can we assess? How can we most effectively teach? And the entire goal here is to improve outcomes, right? And not just intervention, but what can we do to prevent the need for further intervention? So prevention is a big theme in the work that I do. Okay, stop and think about this. Maybe write this down on your piece of paper or on your computer that you have, that a colleague just shared that the science of reading is just a fad. It's going to come and go like all the other educational initiatives that happen. How would you respond to that colleague? And I'll give you just a little bit of time to do that. Think about this. You might want to incorporate some of your own words. One thing we know from research is that when you take notes in your own words or summarize things, you learn things better, and we want to apply that strategy to kids and adults. All right, let's stamp this learning. Did you say something like this? Well, the science of reading is grounded in a vast body of research. It's been tested and retested for over 5 decades. We know that reading is making meaning from print, and we know that there is evidence that shows improved student outcomes, which we're going to dig into a little bit. I think it's really important that we start to think about how we would answer colleagues, right? This sort of helps us consolidate our learning or really cement our learning so that we can continue to build on a solid base. And that leads me to frameworks. I will tell you that you may have seen some other frameworks other than the simple view of reading or Scarborough's rope. Let me just talk about that for a minute. You may see things like the active view of reading, or I know Charles Hume just put out another model of reading. We're going to look tomorrow at a reading and writing model together. And those other models aren't bad. All models are trying to show different things. The reason that I like to start with the simple view of reading is because all models that I just mentioned show some element of the simple view of reading, and it's a really, I don't want to say easy way, it's an easy way to remember the important things involved in the process of reading. So reading ability only results from a combination of decoding, which we also call word recognition, and language comprehension. These are what Goff and Tunmer said in 1986 are the cognitive capacities that need to be developed. So those things inside of your mind that you need to be able to develop to continue to become a better and better reader. The simple view of reading. I'm sure many of you have seen this before. You've probably had professional developments on it before. It is a good model to ground yourself in no matter what you're thinking. Even when I do advanced professional developments now with people that know this model and have seen this model, we always go back and ground ourselves in this because Skilled reading is only a product of instantly recognizing words on the page and then being able to understand what those words mean. The two boxes are not created equal, however. Let's start with language comprehension. Language comprehension is really your ability to understand and make sense of both spoken and written language. So in the early grades, when you talk with students, can they respond to you on the same topic? Do they have good vocabulary words? Can they expand on a topic? Can they talk to you about things that they're interested in, right? All of this is making meaning from what you hear, and then eventually you need to make meaning from what you read as you start to understand that printed word. Yes, this idea of language develops naturally. So it's something that we're born with. We are born as natural communicators. Even babies take in all of this language, which we're going to look at that tomorrow. Taking in all the language, and then they start to speak, and then they start to speak words and sentences and even more and more, right? It develops naturally. However, we also have to teach this language when it comes to the language of schooling. And that's a whole other topic that we could get into, but there are differences, and we can't just assume that if a student is in the context of an educational environment, that their language is going to develop naturally. We can leverage that language, but there must be some explicit instruction along with that language development. Word recognition, the ability to read the words on the page. It involves automaticity, right? So I like to call it instant words. That means for those of you that are skilled readers, probably you didn't have to sound out any of the words on this slide. You just instantly recognize them. Or I say, once you see them, you can't unsee them. This does not develop naturally. You have to teach it, and it needs explicit and systematic instruction. So next is Scarborough's reading rope. I like to call it the strands of early literacy development because that's how Scarborough represented it in the first chapter of the book that she actually published this in. But if you notice at the top, you see language comprehension. And if you notice at the bottom in blue, you see word recognition. And if you notice all the way over on the right-hand side, you see skilled reading. You should recognize that as the simple view of reading. Language comprehension, word recognition leads to skilled reading. You see how I say when you ground yourself in that simple view of reading, you can recognize it in other frameworks. What's really great about this is she unpacks all the things that are involved in this. We're not going to do a deep dive into this unpacking, but know that word recognition is something we call a constrained skill, which means that once you learn it, you don't have to go back and relearn it. You can understand sounds, how they're represented with letters, and how they build to make words. And the more you practice that and practice that and practice that, you get really automatic at that. Again, creating what we say are instant words. For students that are dyslexic, this is often the hardest place. This is the place where they often need not a different kind of instruction necessarily, but additional practice and practice and practice, and maybe different kinds of practice to make sure they get to that level of automaticity. The top part of Scarborough's rope, this language comprehension, do you notice how much bigger it is or how much more is involved in that than word recognition? And it's true. There is so much involved in language, including your knowledge and background experiences, your vocabulary, an understanding of sentences or syntax, how things work together in the printed word. You have to have some kind of reasoning or inferencing, and you have to build a mental model, either of what somebody's talking about or what you're reading about. And the fun thing about language comprehension is it's what we call an unconstrained skill, meaning the sky is the limit with language comprehension. As long as you're continuing to learn new things, are a lifelong learner, your language comprehension is going to continue to develop. And we're going to talk about this tomorrow too in relationship to the written word or composing texts. So that's really fun because language, there's no ceiling, there's no limit. You can continue to learn and grow your entire life. But what you can do is become more and more strategic in your approach to text. And we're going to look at some of this when we look at some of the principles. Let's dive in a little bit to the inner workings of the brain. And what's really interesting about how the brain works is that we can actually visually see this association of connection that needs to be made. So you can see right here, any color in the next images is going to be brain activity. And you can see right there, the center part of the brain is sort of lit up, and this is the language center of the brain. And we're going to watch what happens when somebody speaks a word, and then we're going to watch what happens inside the brain when somebody reads a word. So this first slide is all about the spoken word. And follow the brain activity from the left-hand side all the way over to the right-hand side. And you know how, this is really quickly, this is 420 milliseconds. And I said one time to an audience, I don't know how fast a millisecond is. And somebody said, well, a millisecond is a millisecond, but that's really fast, right? 420 milliseconds. So when you speak a word, look at what happens to the activity in your brain. And you notice at that 420 millisecond mark, all the brain activity that happens there in the spoken word. Remember how we talked about language? The sky's the limit on language. This demonstrates that, right? The language area of your brain takes up a whole lot of space. Now we're going to look at somebody reading a word. Notice what happens in the written word. Notice where the activity starts and notice where the activity stops. I'm going to go back one slide. Notice in the spoken word where the activity starts in the center of the brain. In reading words, the activity starts in the back of the brain. But do you notice that in reading a word, it starts in the back of the brain, but it connects to that language center? This connection is really important. And this is what happens when we teach kids how to read. The reading circuit. Notice before, and you'll see the visual area in the back, and you'll see the meaning making that's taking up so much of that middle part of our brain. Do you notice there's no connection between the visual and the meaning? When we connect this reading circuit, this visual word form area helps connect the input that I'm taking in with my eyes to then that meaning and what happens in terms of connecting. Sometimes we think of this a little bit as orthographic mapping, if you've ever heard that. It involves sounds, it involves letters, and it involves making meaning and bringing those connections all together. So it's this circuit in the after that we have to create and develop in our students, and that comes through explicit and systematic instruction. Okay, stop and think about this one a little bit. You're scrolling through social media and you read an article about how reading is simple and natural. And think about that now in light of what we've talked about already. First of all, social media isn't the best place to get your information because often social media reduces things to very small sound bites. And that's just not the best way to get a depth of learning about any topic. But hopefully you get this sense that reading and the process of acquiring literacy isn't natural or simple. We call the simple view of reading only because it's an easy way to describe it, but it's a complex restructuring of the brain for novel pathways for this unnatural task of literacy to be achieved. And it's really important that we develop this early, and sometimes we have to do that through repetition. So let's talk about these principles. These are the things that we have to hold and think about as we're thinking about what it takes to develop proficient reading. I am not going to read all of these because we're going to go through them one by one, but I put this slide in here so that when you get this deck, you can re-reference those 7 things. We're going to spend the most time on numbers 1 through 5 and just lightly touch on 6 and 7. because that's really related a little bit more to the multi-tiered system of support process, but we'll mention them. So first of all, we're all here and we know this, right? Science-based reading instruction is a matter of equity. Who does not deserve to learn how to read? And for those of you involved in the Africa Dyslexia Organization, you know, and you're here because you believe that all students should have the ability to learn how to read. And there is some evidence and growing evidence that about 95% of all children can be taught to read by the end of first grade. Now, that doesn't mean they all are taught to read the same way and at the same pace. But what we do know, even students that are dyslexic, given additional practice during the course of their kindergarten and first grade year, that by the end of that first grade year, they can really be on their way to proficiency. The interesting thing is that what we've found here, at least in the United States, is that I like to throw out another 90 number, but it's a little bit scary. So we know that the majority of students, given good instruction and good intervention when needed, can learn how to read. The problem is that if they're not learning how to read, or they're on the path to proficient reading by the end of first grade or into second grade, the majority of those kids are going to continue to struggle throughout their lifetime. Now, that doesn't mean they can't learn how to read or they can't develop strategies to help them along the way. But all this is saying is those critical, important preschool years, kindergarten, and first grade, even into second grade. So if any of you here are those early teachers, please know how important your work is to the success of a student's reading instruction. So learning to read proficiently in any language requires both of these things. We've already been through the simple view of reading. That's what this represents. Understand that this model has been validated in many, many, many languages, for sure alphabetic languages, but even other languages that are not alphabetic. What do I mean by alphabetic? That a sound is represented by a letter or combination of letters. Also know, like we mentioned before, these two things aren't equal, right? There is a time and place when word recognition skills need to be systematically developed and practiced and practiced and practiced. You don't ever not include language comprehension, but prime time for this word recognition is in the early grades. And this model, I do want to say one other thing. This is a little nuanced understanding of this model, but when you think about skilled reading, and you think about Susan, so me, Dr. Susan, skilled reading, if I read an article about reading science or a research article about how reading develops or something like that, I'm going to have a good comprehension of that because my background knowledge and vocabulary are strong. If Dr. Susan reads an article about physical science or physics, my comprehension isn't going to be the same as my youngest son, who's a physics engineer, because he has a depth of knowledge and understanding that I don't have. So skilled reading can mean something different in different contexts. And at some point we can talk through that reading comprehension and what it means. But just know you need both cognitive capacities. I'm using this slide because this is my frame of reference and point of view, but I think it represents something that you can relate to. Literacy instruction in a language must reflect its unique elements. So here in the United States, we have a growing population of multilingual learners or English language learners, and many are struggling to service Spanish-speaking students. Many of our Latino students aren't proficient readers by grade 4, we don't sometimes understand how to support them. Here's the key here in this principle is that Spanish and English are different kinds of languages. They have different sound spelling patterns. They have different, obviously, meanings. They have different syntax. And so you can't take the research that was developed for English-speaking students and apply it to other languages. You have to pay attention to the internal structure of that language, how sounds and spellings are represented, and how things like syntax is in a language. So reading has to be taught systematically and explicitly. What does that mean? Systematically means you start from the easiest things and you work to the more complex things, and you do it in a very systematic order. You know the order that you're teaching them in. So if you're a first grade teacher, you know what the kindergarten teachers have taught. Students may not have learned it, but you know what's already been taught. So it's a build and build and build and making things increasingly complex. All explicit means is you teach kids what they need to know, you allow them to provide response on that, you give them feedback when they need feedback, and you continue to allow them to practice to their level of mastery. Again, the simple view of reading is distilled into these two terms, but that never implies that the learning is easy. Teaching reading is difficult, especially when you're thinking about individual needs of students. We've already talked about the importance of background knowledge and vocabulary, super critical, right? The more you know about a topic, when you go to read about that topic, the deeper your comprehension is. When you have knowledge of a topic, you also have vocabulary of that associated topic. That helps you read more deeply. It also helps you write better, and we'll cover that tomorrow too. So foundational skills, these are the things that are at the bottom of the rope, right? The word recognition skills, again, systematically and explicitly, you have to engage students in this. So this is not like a boring exercise, right? You want to help kids make that association between the sounds and the letters that represent those sounds. You need to do this in multiple ways, through hearing the sounds, helping students learn how to represent or write those sounds, being able to see and practice those sounds in print, and then being able to use their sound spelling connections to respond in writing to a text. And so there's multiple things involved here. And when we talk again about orthographic mapping, it's the phoneme. How is the sound represented with the grapheme or the letter, and how does that create some sort of meaning? This one we're going to just say, like, universal screening and progress monitoring are really critical. You have to understand where students are in their reading process. Are they at risk for later reading difficulties? And if they are, how are you giving them additional intervention and monitoring how they're doing in that intervention? So this is a really, really, really big topic, but I wanted to mention it here. And then the last thing I wanted to mention is what we mentioned at the top of this presentation, is that science-based reading instruction reduces the need for intervention. So it is a preventative measure. And when you're doing good, strong instruction with a group of students, less students should need that intervention, which means the students that do need that intervention, you can give quality time and focus to those students that need additional intervention. Okay, here we go. We're going to go through some science of reading myths. So I want you to think true or false on some of these next slides. True or false, the science of reading is an educational fad. And hopefully by now you've dispelled this myth and you can say false. It's not a fad. It is the ever-evolving body of evidence that we are following. It's been decades of research that we continue to build on, and it's not going to go away. If you're thinking of it as a fad, then you don't understand the evidence. Betty, thank you for that. False. Love it. Okay, next one. True or false? The science of reading is only about teaching phonics. Feel free to put in the chat. And hopefully by now you've seen this as false. Word recognition, phonics is part of word recognition. Word recognition is only one part. I call it table stakes. You have to have word recognition and you have to have been taught with some phonics, but it's only one part of a very important reading process. So false. The simple view of reading proves that teaching reading is easy. You see where I'm going with this? False also, right? The simple view of reading, and there is a podcast episode that's fabulous on this. The simple view of reading distills or very simply explains the two cognitive capacities involved in skilled reading. Those two cognitive capacities, the ability to instantly recognize words and the ability to comprehend language, whether it's spoken or whether it's written. So this is also false. Anybody that's taught a kid how to read knows that's false, right? The science of reading research is old and outdated, and you already know that this is false. It's not only not old, right? Like it is refreshing itself all the time. And as professionals, we have to continue to ensure that we are thinking about looking at applications, seeing the new research that's out there. This is a place where we often have a caution too. Be careful of what you read and what is being put forth as evidence-based or scientifically based. Go back to what you know, see if it actually makes sense, and do some deeper digging and asking more questions if you're not sure, because it's very easy to get off track, and we can't do that, right? It's different if our getting off track didn't impact anybody, but if we get off track with our students, we are impacting the lives of children. Okay, we are almost done and almost ready for Q&A here. But what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to go back to that list that you created, and I am going to give you another minute to do this. Go back to the list you created, put a check mark by words that you wrote down, and add any new words that you think are really important. So I'm going to go on mute for 1 minute and give you a chance to do that. All right, finish up your final thought. Look at there, systematic. Good job. Any other words that you'd like to throw in the chat that you added to your list, please do that. Scientific and evidence-based, that's great, Violet. And really understanding what those words mean are so critical to how we as professionals approach this craft of teaching writing. FAD, that's a good one. Step by step, great. All right. So hopefully today you're never stop learning, because when you stop learning, you stop growing. And remember, today, I hope I gave you additional information to grow that language comprehension side of your cognitive capacities. So hopefully you're able to think about and talk about things differently than before this session. And it's my hope that you learned something new. And before we take some questions, what I would love for you to do is between today and tomorrow, I want you to think about how reading and writing might be related and some things that you would anticipate hearing about writing that are going to connect to some of what we heard about reading today. And we will start tomorrow's session with that. So with that, let's see if we had any questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lambert. So if you have questions, please, you can either raise your hand and then we can call your name and you can unmute, or you can type it in the chat. So I think there's one question in there already for you.
Yeah, assessment tools to determine reading gaps. This is a really, really good one. Rosalind and I talk about this a lot. So here, there are some things that actually can predict students' reading abilities, right? And we have this assessment in the United States called DIBELS. And there's multiple places, ways that you can get that assessment. But what it will do, it will actually see what areas in the early grades that you might have reading difficulties. And so those areas that you want to look at are, one is phonemic awareness, right? Can students recognize sounds in words? And that's a really important assessment. Actually understanding how well students can do nonsense words. We don't ever want to teach nonsense words, but if you give student a nonsense word and they can decode or sound that word out, they probably have a pretty good sense of phonemic awareness. Another great assessment is spelling, right? Back in the day, you did these activities called dictation. So you would say a word or you would say a combination like a phrase, or you would say a sentence and you would ask students to write that. When you ask students to write that, you can really determine, are students hearing those sound spelling patterns? So that is a great assessment tool to figure out where students are having gaps. Another one too, I would say, is an oral reading fluency passage. And again, you can find these within different assessments. But asking students to read for 1 minute and see how their accuracy is and how their rate is. What we didn't talk about is fluency, but two important elements of fluency are accurately reading words and reading words at an appropriate rate, because that is shown to have a significant correlation to later reading comprehension. So those are just some ideas of things that you could do.
Okay, so I think we had a hand up before we go back to the chat. So is it Tibogo Gabana? Can you unmute and ask your question?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for you. Am I audible? Am I audible?
Yes.
Oh, well, thank you very much for the opportunity. One question here. I have a question. It relates to L1, or let me say, should I say mother tongue? What is the relationship of first language to L1 to L2 with regards to teaching maybe second language, regarding teaching reading of the second language? So what is the relationship there? May you please help in that situation whereby I have my first language, my mother tongue, and then I need to learn the second language. So how does it help if I master the first language, so I need to learn the second language?
Yeah, that's really important, right? So the first language should always be developed and leveraged to learning the second language. So I'm going to use an example from the United States because that's my context. So when we have a student that comes to us whose home language is, let's just say, Spanish, that's most common here in the United States. We need to honor, as an instructor, as a teacher in the classroom, we need to honor that home language because they've heard that language for their entire life. It's the language that they speak at home. It's the language some people would say that they're loved in. And so we want to preserve that. And the reason we want to preserve that is because when you're learning a second language, you can leverage what you know in your first language to help you learn that second language. So teachers can look for common sound spelling patterns, words that may have common meanings or very similar meanings. They can point out places that are very different between your home language and your second language. And so that first language is a linguistic asset, right? You need to leverage that language to make sure you're supporting a student in developing the second. Easier said than done when you're a classroom teacher that maybe isn't familiar with the home language or the first language. But just remember that it's an important asset that we need to leverage. And I would say one more thing with that is that it used to be that people thought that it's too confusing for young children to have one language at home and then be learning another language at school. And very often teachers would tell parents, make sure you don't speak to your child in that first language, just speak English or whatever that, that target second language is in. That is bad advice and absolutely proven to be wrong. because any linguistic asset that you have that's developed in your home language, that is going to benefit you as you're developing a second language. Now, sometimes what we see is the development of that second language may take more time, but in the long run, those students are going to be stronger, and being bilingual is definitely an asset, not just to literacy, but all later outcomes in life. Great question.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. Okay, there was a question in the chat from Ruth. Please, how should reading be taught? Kindly
Very
walk through the stages.
Yeah, very good question. So I can't walk through all the detailed stages, but I'm going to give you some buckets of things to think about. So when we think about how reading should be taught, first of all, let's think about the language development part. So before students come to school, they should have books read aloud to them. They should have rich conversations about topics, right? So in the preschool environment, all of those sort of pre-literacy skills should be developed, or a language should be encouraged. We should think about asking students to respond to open-ended questions. The more that we can get them exposed to that language, the better. When they come to us in pre-K or kindergarten, instructors or teachers should be reading aloud books to them that are at nothing that they could read on their own, but they're rigorous picture books with interesting topics that have rich vocabulary. Again, we're developing that language part. When we're thinking about the word recognition development, we want to think about helping students hear things like rhyming words, and then start to hear things like beginning sounds. And then we're going to think about how to start to introduce them to the match between sounds and spellings. And so that involves a little bit of phonemic awareness. Can you hear the sound? What's the beginning sound in the word bat and ball, right? Can you hear the same sound? And then this is how you draw a picture of that sound, or the letter that represents that sound. And of course, I can't do it backwards on my screen, but you understand what I'm trying to do here. And then you teach kids how to put the sounds together, to blend words, right? And practicing that with this sort of continuous blending, so you don't end up with kids doing b-at all the time, but bat, right? And practicing that over and over and over again, and then getting them into longer and longer text, and then moving into what we call advanced code. And for us here in the United States, that would sort of be like the C and H put together makes the ch sound, or WH put together makes the wh or wh sound, right? And then moving into multisyllabic words and being able to apply those sound spelling patterns to bigger and bigger words, while at the same time developing their vocabulary, giving them enriching things to think and talk about in terms of the content area. And so if we go back to, I think I'm still sharing my screen, I want to go back to Scarborough's rope. And that's a great representation, even though, here we go. So we're going to teach those word recognition skills. By the time kids get to second or third grade, we shouldn't have to teach these anymore. They may need to practice in multisyllabic words, but then we're going to move over to do more in this language comprehension side. But notice, we don't not do this language comprehension in the early grades. This comes from rich read-alouds, discussions about text, discussions about things that they're listening to or seeing, so that these elements can sort of all come together. And here in the United States, we say that's typically around third or fourth grade when they're really secure in their word recognition, and then they're starting to be more strategic in their comprehension of text. Hopefully that was helpful. That's a really big question, Ruth.
Okay, I see Martin has his hand up. Do you have a question for us, Martin?
I have a question, so Josiah is going to continue.
Okay, thank you.
So looking at my background, I'm going to talk about persons with hearing impairments, the deaf people. So with them, how they do, most of them do not have sound. So how to get the language or with reading and writing, how do they develop about them? And then with their language, they have sign language syntax, which sign language is a language on its own, and then spoken language is a language on its own. So you being a specialist, how do you train people like that? And then concerning your presentation, you, with the part of the brain, how the brain hears sounds and interprets it. With a person with hearing impairment, how does the person interpret the words he or she sees, and then how they understand? And then the second issue too is, you see, most of them grow up in a community where sound moves around them, but they don't hear, so it makes them lag behind. So what are the things to be done to help persons with hearing impairments?
You know what? I am unqualified to answer that question, unfortunately. And I don't even want to step into that world to try. But I'm sure we can dig up some information to try to help you with that. But I wish I could answer it, but that is not my area of expertise at all. I'm so sorry.
I think that probably brings up maybe another training session ADO might have to look into that
I think that would
specifically
be
looks
great.
at those with hearing
Yep.
needs. Yeah. So thank you. Thank you for your question, Martin. So we'll definitely note that one down. Okay, so let's go back to the chat. Amelia has a question about how do you help learners who recognize words but can't spell?
Ah, a lot of times the issue with students that recognize words but can't spell, the issue is they're really good memorizers. And what they need is, the first thing is, were they explicitly taught the sound spelling patterns, or are they really good at memorizing the words and then they go to apply those patterns to different words and it doesn't work? And we see this a lot, especially when it comes to, all the way up to like second grade or into third grade. It's like, this student can read really well, but when we start to get into them spelling more difficult words or multisyllabic words, so words with many syllables, it breaks down. So the first thing is to make sure they were actually taught that basic sound spelling code. And the second thing is, remember that anytime, and we're going to talk about this tomorrow, anytime you write anything, it's more difficult. So anytime you either speak or you write, that expressive language is more difficult than the receptive language of reading and listening. And so sometimes if a student can read but can't spell, they may need then more practice in what we call encoding. And so they may need more dictation practice or nonsense word practice, or like to make sure that they're getting those sound spelling patterns secure. And so that's just a couple of ways.
Wonderful. Okay, so let me read the next question out for you from Angela. Angela's asking, how does the science of reading fit within the IB, the International Baccalaureate Program, PYP, the primary years program, especially where all learning is situated within units of inquiry?
Yeah,
She's
it's
also, sorry, go on.
No, I can see. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. Share a structure, a step-by-step process of how to teach reading. So I think the IB program, and I don't know it that well, but I know the units of inquiry in the IB program are all about knowledge building. So that's one thing that's great about the International Baccalaureate program. And when you think about knowledge building, I still have this slide up, you think about this sort of top part, right? The language development, helping students understand and build background knowledge, the vocabulary associated with it, what syntax and structure looks like within math or within history or any of those domain topics, right? So that's really important for students to learn, even in the early grades, right? Like in the early grades. You need to be able to have this sort of word recognition strand that runs through it. And that step-by-step process is that thing that I just explained. Knowing that in kindergarten, our students are going to be taught the sound spelling pattern. in first grade, we're going to go to this sound spelling pattern. In second grade, this sound spelling pattern. And having that scope and sequence of sound spelling patterns that students are explicitly taught. And the way I like to think about that is sort of a three-pronged kind of thing, right? You're going to introduce the sound, you're going to introduce the spelling of that sound or how you represent that sound. Sometimes it's with one letter, sometimes it's with two, sometimes it's with three, depending on how complex it is. You're going to practice that, and then you're going to have students see those sound spelling patterns in print. And we like to talk about using decodable text, meaning only the sound spelling patterns that students have been introduced to are represented in that print. Now, decodable text can get a bad rap, but let me tell you, you don't want students in decodable text all the time. You want them in there so that you can teach them and get them really fluent in practicing those sound spelling patterns. They're not meant to be like great literature or anything. They're meant to help students practice that one particular thing. And so being able to put that structure of the thread of word recognition alongside this idea of units of inquiry would be a great strategy.
Thank you. Okay, we've got lots more time for more questions. So let's read the next one. From Jennifer, what strategies improve reading comprehension?
Oh, I love this question. Go back and listen to all of us season 10 that we just did about the comprehension, but let me give you a few things. So often we think about strategies or comprehension strategies as find the main idea or summarize. And those are great sort of fix-up things to do when you're not understanding a text. But let's go back to Scarborough's rope. So you see here skilled reading on the right-hand side of the rope. We're calling that reading comprehension. So here's all the things that impact reading comprehension. If you have a student that's not comprehending well, what is the issue? We'll walk backwards. Is it word recognition? Are they not able to sound out words or instantly recognize words, right? This is word recognition in the early grades, highest impact strategy for reading comprehension. Make sure you're teaching those sound spelling patterns or teaching phonics. And again, we're not creating decoders forever. We're using decoding as the end game to automatically or instantly recognize words. So that's one strategy, is this whole thing right here. Other things you can do, let's go backwards in the language comprehension. Build students' knowledge. If you're going to read a short excerpt or a full text, that students might need to understand something like, maybe the context of the text that we're going to read is Alaska and it's talking about snow and sled dogs. I'm guessing in Ghana, you don't have that much experience with snow or dog sledding, right? You need to build that background knowledge to help students then comprehend that. Or maybe it's vocabulary. Maybe you're reading a science topic and students aren't familiar with the vocabulary words. Make sure you pre-teach those vocabulary words. Great strategy to help them comprehend more deeply. Sentence structure. I mean, we're finding, talk about new research and research that's evolving and emerging, this idea of sentence level comprehension or syntax. And so when you read a single sentence or a compound sentence, sometimes you don't, as a good reader, you don't understand how much comprehension can break down just at that sentence level. And so helping students really understand the structure of sentences and how those sentences are put together into paragraphs is another great strategy. Teaching kids how to make inferences, even the simple gap-filling inferences that sometimes need to be made. And I could talk about that for a whole other hour, but helping students make inferences is important. And then this last one, mental model, this idea of when you're a reader, you're building this image in your head of what's happening in the text that you're reading. If the image in your head somehow isn't quite right, your comprehension is impacted. And so you need to make sure that we can help students use their knowledge, vocabulary, their understanding of sentences, their inferencing, their reasoning skills to build these strong mental models. And that also is important for writing too, and we can talk about that a little bit tomorrow. And then the last thing I would say is there is this bi-directional relationship between fluency and comprehension. So the better you comprehend a text, the more fluent you are going to be when you read it. The more fluent you are when you read a text, the better you're going to comprehend it. And remember, fluency is not just expression or how you're reading, it's accuracy, it's rate, which we've already talked about those two things, and then prosody or the rhythm of the language, which is really, really important. And so those are just some of the ways that you can improve reading comprehension. That was a lot, Samantha.
That that is a lot. That's a lot of information, a lot of useful information and tips for us to go away with. Okay, we have some more questions in the chat and we have more time. Dr. Lambert, you okay to continue?
I'm okay.
Wonderful. I don't know if you've already kind of covered this, but question next from Jeffrey says, can students' first language affect their English language reading words?
Yeah, it actually can. So remember that strength in the first language is helpful for strength in the English language, but it also works the other way too. Any sort of weakness in first language can also impact then English language reading words. And so, when I work with schools, the best we can do is try to have a formal screening assessment for students in both their home language and the language that they're learning, so that you can find any sort of reading difficulties they may have. Because if they're true difficulties in the first language, they very likely will carry over to that second language. But again, the flip side of that is strength in that first language leads to strength in the long run, at least, of English language. And reading words could be, again, it could be the phoneme grapheme mapping, right? So the map between the sound and the spelling, or it could be related to the meaning element, right? So when we're reading words, we do all of those things. We represent sounds with letters, and that could impact it if they don't have that sound letter connection correct. And then also meaning. So anytime you're working with multilingual learners, ensuring that they understand the meaning. It's as simple as cat. Here's a picture of a cat, right? To make sure they're making that connection. So yes, again, that was a lot, Samantha.
All right. From Ruth, can dyslexia be outgrown through interventions, or does it cease to be pronounced due to alternative options available, e.g. audio?
So true dyslexia cannot be outgrown. And you can ask anybody with dyslexia that question, and they will tell you the same thing. My son, Michael, who's dyslexic, has found workarounds for that. So he still isn't the best reader, but in your example, Ruth, he employs audiobooks, and he also employs tools to help him write. So he still composes on his own. So he'll still write on his own, but he uses things like Grammarly, which is a tool to sort of help you with your spelling and making your sentences appropriate. The other thing Michael has learned to do is read his own work out aloud. And when he hears it, he can recognize that something isn't right. So dyslexia can't be outgrown. We can help students get more automatic in their word recognition and better in their spelling. But the thing is, we really need to help them be confident in who they are as learners. And if if they have strategies that will help support them, we want to help them use those strategies effectively.
Thank you so much. Okay. A question from Wisdom. At what age or age bracket is the science of reading most effective?
Great question. Every age, it just depends on which science of reading we're employing. So we know that, for example, I think I've said it before, this word recognition side of the science of reading, the sounds and the letters and the words, the phonemic awareness, phonics, most effective if we do that in the first few grades. So like kindergarten, first and second grade. But we also know like oral language is really important all the way through our literacy journey. We know that building vocabulary is important all the way through our literacy journey, right? So it's not at what age or what age bracket the science of reading is most effective. I think the better question is, what research can we apply to the age we're working with? And then also remember that if students haven't learned what they should have learned in previous grades or what was taught to them, they need additional intervention and practice with that. So the science of reading is just a really, really big body of work. And it depends what area we're talking about when it's most effective. I hope that answers that question, Wisdom.
Okay, another question from Ruth. Is there a criterion of fonts or typeface and color that is recommended as being easier on the eye or brain for dyslexic learners?
No. And color therapy has been proven ineffective. It just doesn't, there's people all over the world that are like making money on something that's been dispelled. And typically no with fonts. There has been no like dyslexia font that's been proven to be better. I will say there is a difference, and not just for kids with dyslexia, but for other kids too, that print font or scripted font, right? You need to teach both handwriting with both printed handwriting and in cursive, because there is a difference. There's a lot of kids that never were taught cursive writing, and so they can't read more scripted font. But that's not related to dyslexia. That's just related to learning in general. So no, there is no typeface or color that has been shown. Now, that's not true for those that have color blindness. For those with color blindness, there are definitely colors that are easier or more difficult to see, but not for dyslexia.
Okay, thank you. That's very clear. Letitia says, how do you help a learner, I don't know if I got it, in difficulty understanding what is read?
So that's the language side, right? So that would be understanding the words or how the sentences are put together. And I would say this one is a little more complicated because it depends on what they're not understanding. So again, the idea that can we read them something that they know a lot about? So when I was a kid, I loved to read about horses, right? I was hoping that I could have a horse when I grew up. I don't know, I think every kid in America, girl in America wanted to have a horse. If somebody would have read to me something about a topic I was really interested in, I might be able to understand that. And so finding a topic that the student knows something about or is interested in, if they can understand that, that's a great first start, and then make connections to other things that they're not understanding. And this is where vocabulary plays a really critical role. This is where understanding at the sentence level. So if you're reading a sentence aloud, you may have to help that child unpack what's in that sentence or understand the sentence by sentence. The other thing that can help if you're reading out loud is visuals, or having the student draw what they're hearing so that you can actually understand what they're thinking as that text is being read aloud. So those are a few ideas.
All right, thank you. Our next question says, How is a balance struck between the spoken and written in early years?
Great question. So always speak, no matter how old a child or a person is. Speaking is so important to overall literacy development, particularly in the early years, but throughout our lifetime, right? And if you think about as adults, how often we speak to people to help us work through ideas. The written language and an understanding and familiarity with the written language is important. Now, here in the United States, we say things like, just because a parent reads to their child doesn't mean their child is going to learn to read, which is correct. But when parents read to children, or when teachers read picture books to children, it helps them understand the orientation of the written word, because the written word is more complex than the spoken word. So when we show kids tracking from left to right or right to left, if that's the language you're teaching, how we track the text on the page, how we look at how individual words are separated, how we then move to individual sounds within words, right? So that's important. It's also really important to read aloud to children. I mean, read aloud up through 8th grade is my general rule. But reading aloud a lot to those kids in the early grades, kindergarten and 1st grade, because that will help them hear the rhythm of the language, how authors construct sentences and put paragraphs together. And that's sort of the immersion into the language part of this. So I think that is really important as well.
Thank you. Okay, from Letitia, how do you teach a child with language delay reading?
Yeah, I think I explained some of those when we talked about the spoken language. And again, remembering that the language delay, is it related to vocabulary and syntax? So in other words, is the language delay related here? Or would the language delay be related to word recognition, that they're not being able to hear the sounds? And so first of all, you have to understand. So all of this is language, right? So first you have to understand that language delay. And if it's a language delay, like they didn't speak until later, right? That expressive part that's where it's going to take a little time and patience, and making sure we continue to express our language to them. So you still want those kids with language delays. You still want them to be spoken to a lot, be read to a lot, so that you can help them hear that language and see that language, and then sort of break it down. Again, kids with dyslexia, kids with language delays, it takes more time and more repetition. Kids with language delays, sometimes it can take even more time because language is such a big bucket. There is a website put together by Charles Hume, who is out of the UK. I think it's called Oxed, or Ox Education, something like that, has some really good strategies and information on their website. So you might want to check that out.
Great.
Oh.
Another good, oops.
Go ahead. I'll find my slide. There we go.
Right, another good question here. How do you teach a child who constantly interchanges letter names with letter sounds?
Oh, so in other words, I think this question, Patience, is if I showed, I'm going to write on a piece of paper here. If I showed this, they would say M instead of M. And I think that is just additional practice and helping them explicitly know that, yep, the name of that letter is M, but it represents the sound M, M, M. And so I think that's just additional explicit one-on-one practice, or one-on-one instruction, and then additional practice. And a good way to do that is to put it into the context of words, right? And show the child you can't sound out the word M-A-T. That's not sounding out a word. You have to, what sounds do they represent? At, mat, right? And so just doing that explicit instruction to get them out of the habit of naming the letter as opposed to the sound.
Okay, and following on from that regarding sounds, how do you know a child has truly mastered segmenting sounds versus memorizing? And that comes from Sarah, that question.
Have them write words. Have them read nonsense words. That's a really good place to start, but then have them write. So those dictation sentences, and have them spell words. If they have not mastered sounds, they won't be able to segment those sounds and write those words. So that's the best assessment to figure it out. As a matter of fact, that kind of diagnostic assessment is brilliant to use, because if you give them, let's say, a sentence with some sound spelling patterns that you're trying to see if they've mastered, if they can't spell those words, you need to reteach the reading part of that, the sound spelling pattern part of that. So writing is always a great way to see what kids know.
Great, thank you. I hope that's answered your question, Sarah. Next question from Violet. How effective is the U-Fly reading for learners with dyslexia?
I know the program UFly, but I'm not sure the effectiveness and if they've done effectiveness with that for dyslexia. But that comes from the Florida Center for Reading Research. And I know they have a website, and I'd really encourage you to go on their website and see if they have any efficacy research, or how have they done any research with students with dyslexia. So I would point you there.
Okay. Letitia's question, does reading fluency have a connection with comprehension? If yes, does this mean if students have knowledge of the passage they're reading, they should be able to read fluently?
So first question, does reading fluently have a connection with comprehension? Yes. And so remember, we defined fluent reading as accurate word recognition, appropriate rate in terms of reading, and then prosody, your expression, right? Like your rhythm of your language. There is a relationship. The better you comprehend, the more fluent you are. The more fluent you are, the better you comprehend. But just because students have knowledge of a passage, that doesn't mean they can be fluent readers, right? It will help them comprehend that in the long run. But if they can't sound those words out or accurately recognize those words, they won't be fluent. If they're not recognizing their words, those words, their rate is going to be impacted, right? So you know how this is when you're reading along in a sentence and you come to a word you don't know, you like stop, you're like, and your focus goes on that word, and you've forgotten all the rest that's happened. So it impacts your reading comprehension. Knowledge of a passage helps engage you in that passage, and it helps you comprehend more deeply, but that knowledge alone is not sufficient.
Okie doke, thank you. Oops, I've lost my place. Okay, so Moses is asking, how will a teacher use science of reading to correct rote reading?
I think is the question asking what's the correct route to reading on this. And I think I sort of talked about, sort of the progression of things that you need to do in order to learn how to read according to evidence-based practices. If that's not the question, I don't understand the question.
Yeah, maybe Moses, you can unmute and ask your question if we haven't understood it well. While we're doing that, let's take the question from Phyllis. What is the best way to help learners who know letter names but cannot blend sounds to read words?
Practice. Teaching them the sounds and the sound spelling patterns and the associations, having them hear the words read, and then just practice blending, right? And sometimes it takes kids a long time. I like this idea of continuous blending, where you, if we use the example cat and mat, let's use mat, right? Like show them how to go all the way through. And as opposed to pointing to each letter, at, what you're going to do is you're going to take your finger and run all the way, mat, and teach them how to stretch those sounds out to do that. And then it might just be practice, practice, practice. And some kids need more practice than others. Some pick it up really quickly. They get the idea and they can move on. Some kids need more practice. You have to give kids the practice time that they need to have.
Thank you. All right, Prince is asking, is the science of reading more effective than the traditional approaches to teaching reading?
Yes.
In simple response, in one word.
Kind of like traditional approaches might mean different things in different contexts, right? So the traditional, what we would call, I think, here in the United States, we would call it the whole language method or balanced literacy, where there was a belief that if you just immersed kids in the print, they're sort of going to figure out how to read words. And that actually wasn't true, right? We know that you have to explicitly teach kids. So I would say that's our traditional approach. And we know that the evidence has mounted for years and years and years and years. And we know that that is an ineffective way to teach. And that's what's pushing us here in the United States to a more effective way to teach. Now, I'm not sure what traditional means in many contexts, but we do know the science of reading and the simple view of reading. Let me see if I can go backwards here. The simple view of reading tells us that no matter what, in order to be a skilled reader, kids need to be taught word recognition, how sounds are represented by letters and how letters build to make words, explicit instruction in that, and they need to increase their understanding of how language works, knowledge and vocabulary, how we put sentences together. So this has been validated in languages across the world many times. And so effective instruction develops both of these cognitive capacities, and that is more effective.
Thank you. Well said. Maybe you've already answered this question from Phyllis. What interventions work best for learners who are behind in reading?
It depends on what they're behind in, right? That's the place where you really have to understand the profile of the student that you're working with. And so a couple things. First of all, is helping them get, for whatever their need is, scaffolding strategies so that they can have access to the universal instruction or the core instruction that's taught in the classroom, and then being really clear about what it is that they need to fill the gap. And you need assessments to help you with that. What it is they need to fill the gap, and then explicitly teaching those things and monitoring their progress against those things. So the intervention that works best for kids who are behind depends on what they're behind in.
Thank you, Dr. Susan. All right. So Bertha wants to know what the best way is to teach an autistic child to read basic words and identify pictures.
Wow, autism is such a range. There are some, I taught an autistic child who I had him in my classroom for 2 years. And year one, I wasn't sure that my instruction was getting through at all. And we just did more extra practice. And all of a sudden he was able to do it. I think the same approach to teaching reading basic words and understanding the meaning of them using pictures, the same thing that we would do, which is teach the sound represented by the letter, look at individual letters blending into words. But it's probably, depending on the level of autism, of course, it may take really slow and measured instructional approaches, so shorter time periods in terms of working with the individual sound spelling patterns, more practice before you add on. I think that's one idea.
Thank you. All right, I'm just looking at the time. I think we're going to see if we can wrap up with the last 3 questions that are in the chat. So starting with Angela's question, which is, assuming a student in grade 6 finds it difficult to identify sounds, affecting their reading and writing? How do you provide intervention for such a student who's missed the foundation all through kindergarten and the lower grades, 1 to 3? Can
Yeah.
this difficulty be addressed fully in grade 6?
Yes, absolutely can be addressed in grade 6. And typically what you'll find is that for students in grade 6, they have heard the sounds, and you can probably start with multisyllabic words and look at patterns of words. So this is a great place where you can employ morphology to help you, or word parts, and always, always, always connect them to meaning. And so I would always start with chunks of words as opposed to the individual sounds, and see how well, because I'm guessing a student in grade 6 can identify some sounds, but they can't identify all of them. And starting with bigger chunks of words often helps more. I think, like I said, multisyllabic words. And then if you find, no, they're still missing things, you can go down to individual sounds. One other thing I would say about students in the upper grades like that seem to have difficulty with sounds, I would also make sure they can discriminate between short vowel sounds, because I find that if you can get those short vowel sounds for them practiced, practice hearing them, practice seeing them, that often leads to huge gains, because distinguishing, at least in English, between short vowels and long vowels, if you can't hear the differences, that's going to impact your reading. And then when you get extra practice identifying the right? Then when you see it in print, they can really go to town with those multisyllabic words. So that's another suggestion.
Okay, right. So I'm going to take the last 2 questions for the chat. So Upendo says, how do you help a child who is able to blend and read the words very well, but writes the letters in opposite direction, like tab for bat, or the letters like P and write them like 9?
So that again would be going back to hearing the sound and then helping them practice. And sometimes you have to be very multi-sensory with that practice. So they can, again, this goes to receptive language, or language you take in, is much easier to master than expressive, or language that you have to represent. And so going back to the thing that they know, if they know that the P makes the P sound, help them practice that. And maybe it's like air writing and writing on paper, and whatever you can do to get that extra practice in is a good strategy. Again, that might take time, right? And extra practice. But again, drawing on their asset, they have the ability to read the words, but they can't represent the words. So go from what they know to what they need extra practice in.
All right, so let's take our last question. How do you build speech with a 5-year-old child who is nonverbal and has Down syndrome?
Man, that's another one, Samantha, that's out of my area of expertise.
Yeah.
And so I would say, though, that it's still important that you read to that 5-year-old child, that you speak with that 5-year-old child, and encourage them to actually use that language. But when it comes to specific strategies you can do, that is not my area of expertise.
Okay, just wrapping up now, looking at the time. Thank you so much, Dr. Lambert. You have really taken the time to answer so many questions this evening. We really appreciate you for that. Thank you for an outstanding session. Thank you so much to Martin and Josiah for ensuring accessibility throughout with the sign language interpretation. And thank you to each of you for your time and engagement. I think the number of questions that came through has really showed how you have been engaged in this session, and how much I'm sure it will impact your work as educators. So the feedback form for today's session is about to be shared in the chat shortly. Please do take 5 minutes to complete it. It's so important that you complete the feedback form. Your responses really help us to improve our programs for educators and learners across Africa. So take a look in the chat. You will see the link for the feedback form. So please do, like I said, take some few minutes to complete that feedback. Okay, so now I want to just go over again about the certificates of participation. Now, this is a reminder that your certificate for participants who complete the feedback form and make the voluntary contribution of 50 cedis or the dollar equivalent, $5 for one session. If it's for 2 sessions, then that will be 100 cedis or $10. Now, please remember to indicate which of the sessions you've paid for. If you're just paying for today's, please note it when you message us. If you want to receive a hard copy, then that would be 100 cedis for one session. Now, after you make payment, you must please send a WhatsApp message showing the proof of payment. The number will be shared in the chat as well again, but I'll read it out for you. It's 024 184 3287. So after making payment, please send to the WhatsApp number your full name, and that should be the name as you want it to appear on your certificate, and then also your correct email address. We need both in order to be able to ensure that you get your digital certificate. Please don't just send the payment screenshot alone, because our accounts team won't be able to process your certificate in that way. Okay, I know there was a few of you asking in the chat whether this has been recorded. Yes, the session recording and any available resources will be available and shared with all participants who registered. So once you have registered, you will receive the session recording and any available resources. Okay, I want to say thank you once again to Dr. Susan Lambert. We really look forward to seeing all of you again back here tomorrow for day 2, where we're going to be looking at the science of writing. And it's going to be at the same time from 6 p.m. to 8 p.m. So thank you so much again, and have a good evening to all of you. I'll see you online tomorrow at 6 p.m. As you're taking your time to log out, please just check the chat. You'll see the certificate information is in there and the information, the link for the feedback form. So remember, please complete the feedback form and please take note of the instructions for your certificate. Thank you once again and good night.